What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 001, charging murder in the first degree, victim Daniel D. Abreu. Do you find the defendant not guilty, guilty of murder in the first degree, or guilty of murder in the second degree?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 002, charging murder in the first degree, victim Zafiro Furtado. Do you find the defendant not guilty, guilty of murder in the first degree, or guilty of murder in the second degree?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 003, charging armed assault with intent to murder, victim Aquilino Freire. Do you find the defendant not guilty, or guilty of this offense as charged?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 004, charging armed assault with intent to murder, victim Gerson Lopes. Do you find the defendant not guilty, or guilty of the offense as charged?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 005, charging armed assault with intent to murder, victim Rashidis Sanchez. Do you find the defendant not guilty, or guilty of the offense as charged?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 006, charging assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon, to wit, a firearm, victim Aquilino Freire. Do you find the defendant not guilty, or guilty of this offense as charged?
Not guilty.
What say you, Madam Foreperson, on indictment 2014-10417, offense 007, charging possession of a firearm, not home, work, no license, to wit, a .38 caliber revolver, the date of July 16, 2012. Do you find the defendant not guilty, or guilty of the offense as charged?
Guilty of the offense as charged.
Word races.
All right.
He smiled. That's the detail that stayed with everyone who was in that courtroom. Not the evidence, not the testimony, not the mountain of forensic data that had been building against him for 2 years. The smile. Aaron Hernandez, sitting at the defense table in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with a $40 million NFL contract already gone, with a dead man's family sitting 20 feet away from him, smiled like a man who had never once believed this moment would actually arrive. And then the judge spoke. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. This isn't just a story about a football player who threw everything away. Those stories exist. We've heard them. They follow a predictable arc, and they end in a predictable place. This is something else entirely. This is a story about what happens when talent becomes armor, when fame convinces a person that the rules that govern everyone else simply don't apply to them, and about the precise moment that armor shatters in a room full of strangers and cameras, and a judge who has seen every version of his performance before. Aaron Hernandez didn't just fall from grace. He fell from a height so extraordinary that the distance between who he was and where he ended up is almost impossible to measure. And the fall didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in 100 small decisions, each one feeling justified, each one pulling him 1 inch closer to a cell, a Bible, and 3 handwritten letters that no one was supposed to read. What you're about to hear will change how you think about talent, about loyalty, about the stories we tell ourselves when we're standing on the edge of something we can't take back. Stay with me, because this one doesn't end where you think it does. Before we go any further, right now, before this story pulls you under, hit subscribe. I cover cases like this one, cases that don't let you go, cases that ask uncomfortable questions about human nature, and the edges we all walk closer to than we'd like to admit. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand not just what happened, but why, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now, and while you're at it, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from, because people from all over the world follow these cases. And I want to know who's in the room with me tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Aaron Hernandez grew up in Bristol, Connecticut, the younger of two sons born to Dennis and Terry Hernandez. Bristol is the kind of city that produces athletes the way other cities produce accountants. It's working class, football obsessed, and deeply proud of its sons when they make it out. Aaron made out further and faster than almost anyone Bristol had ever seen. By the time he was a teenager, he was already the best football player in his school, his city, arguably his state. The tight end position seemed invented for someone with his combination of size, speed, and hands that caught everything like they were magnetized. He had the rare quality that scouts spend their careers looking for, the ability to make the game look slower than it is, to see angles before they open, to be somewhere before the player requires him to be there. But Aaron's childhood carried a wound that never properly healed. His father, Dennis, was the gravitational center of his world. The man who coached him, pushed him, loved him with a particular ferocity of a father who sees extraordinary potential in his child and pours everything into it. Dennis Hernandez died unexpectedly from complications following a hernia surgery in 2006. Aaron was 16 years old. People who knew him then described before and an after. Before Dennis died, Aaron was intense but grounded. After, something in him went untethered. The discipline, the structure, the singular relationship that had organized his entire emotional life. It was simply gone. And what grew in that empty space was something more complicated, more dangerous, and ultimately more tragic than anyone around him could fully recognize in time. He enrolled at the University of Florida on a football scholarship. He was extraordinary on the field. Off it, he was already accumulating associations that should have alarmed the people responsible for him. He was connected to a shooting incident in Gainesville that was never conclusively linked to him, but that followed him like a shadow through the NFL draft process. Teams did their due diligence. Some passed. The New England Patriots, with their famously rigorous evaluation process, their culture of discipline, their reputation for transforming complicated players into functional team members. The Patriots took him in the 4th round of the 2010 NFL Draft, and for a while it worked. In Foxborough, under Bill Belichick's regime, within a system built around Rob Gronkowski and Tom Brady, Aaron Hernandez became one of the most dangerous offensive weapons in professional football. He was electric. He was beloved. By 2012, the Patriots had given him a contract extension worth up to $40 million. He had a home in North Attleboro. He had a fiancée, Cheyenne Jenkins, who had been by his side since middle school. He had a daughter, Ale, who he spoke about with the kind of unguarded tenderness that surprised people who had read the reports about his past. He had everything, and he was still making the choices that would take it all away. Here's where I need you to pause with me for a second, because this is the part of the story that I find genuinely haunting. Not the crime, not the courtroom. This part. At some point in 2012 or early 2013, Aaron Hernandez was simultaneously one of the most celebrated athletes in the country, and a man whose private life was spiraling toward catastrophe in ways that most people around him couldn't see or refused to see. He was attending nightclubs, maintaining associations with people from his past who operated in a different world entirely from the one the NFL had built for him, and carrying what prosecutors would later describe as a paranoid, volatile temper that could ignite overperceived slights so minor they barely registered to anyone else. He was also, according to everyone who knew him personally, capable of extraordinary warmth. He was protective of his daughter. He was loyal to Cheyenne with an intensity that had its own possessive edge. He was the kind of friend who remembered details, who showed up, who made people feel like they were the only person in the room. Both of these things were true simultaneously. And that's the version of this story I don't want you to lose, because it's the version that actually teaches us something. Monsters are easy to understand. People are harder. Aaron Hernandez was not a monster. He was a person who made choices that resulted in monstrous consequences. That distinction matters. That's the distinction this whole story turns on. What's your read on that? I want to know. When you hear about someone like Aaron Hernandez, someone with that level of talent, that level of love for his daughter, and that level of violence existing in the same person, does it make sense to you? Does it challenge how you think about what people are capable of? Drop your theory in the comments. I'm reading every single one. June 17, 2013. That date sits at the center of everything like a stone dropped in still water. Every ripple that came after, the arrest, the trial, the notes, the verdict, the cell, the Bible, every single ripple traces back to that night. Odin Lloyd was 27 years old. He played semi-professional football for the Boston Bandits. He was dating Shania Jenkins, the sister of Aaron Hernandez's fiancée Cheyenne, which placed him in a complicated, overlapping social orbit with Hernandez. He was the kind of young man who appears in the background of other people's stories, not famous, not notorious, just living, just working, just falling in love with a girl whose sister happened to be engaged to one of the most famous athletes in New England. That proximity, that incidental geographic and social closeness, would cost him his life, according to prosecutors. Hernandez became convinced that Odin Lloyd had been talking to people Hernandez had serious personal conflicts with, talking to them, not working against Hernandez, not threatening him, not doing anything that in any rational moral framework would justify what happened next, just talking. In Hernandez's internal world, apparently, that was enough. The perception of disloyalty. And we don't even know with certainty that Lloyd was disloyal in any meaningful sense. Appears to have been sufficient trigger. Around 2:30 in the morning on June 17th, Hernandez, along with two associates named Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace, drove a rented silver Nissan Altima to Odin Lloyd's Boston home and picked him up. Think about what that means for a moment. Lloyd got in the car. He got in willingly. Whatever tension may have existed between him and Hernandez, it wasn't at a level that made Lloyd afraid to get in the car with him at 2:30 in the morning. Or if he was afraid, he didn't act on that fear. He got in. He texted his sister shortly before he was killed. The messages were abbreviated. He told her he was with NFL, his informal way of referencing Hernandez. He wrote, "Just so you know, just so you know," those 3 words. What did he mean by them? Was he being casual? Was he nervous and trying to signal something without alarming her? Was he simply excited to be hanging out with someone famous? We will never know what was in Odin Lloyd's mind when he typed those words into his phone. But they became, in the hands of prosecutors, one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the entire case. A young man, in the last hour of his life, sending a message that reads both like a mundane update and like a whispered warning in a crowded room. The silver Altima made its way to an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, less than a mile from Aaron Hernandez's $1.3 million home. Odin Lloyd was shot 6 times with a .45 caliber weapon. His body was discovered by a jogger the following morning, lying in a field. He was 27 years old. The investigation that followed moved with a speed that seemed to surprise even experienced law enforcement observers. Within hours of the body being found, detectives were already pulling phone records and surveillance footage that pointed directly and unmistakably toward Aaron Hernandez. And here's where the story shifts from tragedy into something almost operatic in its irony. Hernandez had installed an extensive personal security camera system in his home. Cameras everywhere, ostensibly for protection, for privacy, for the kind of controlled surveillance that extremely wealthy people sometimes surround themselves with when they believe threats might come from outside their walls. Those same cameras recorded the group leaving that night. They recorded the group returning. They recorded Aaron Hernandez appearing to hold a firearm. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with the estimated time of Odin Lloyd's death. The cameras he installed to watch for danger had watched him instead. Shell casings from the rented Altima matched shell casings recovered at the crime scene. DNA from a piece of chewed bubblegum, a discarded, ordinary piece of blue babiches, placed Hernandez in the vicinity of where Lloyd's body was found. Cell phone tower data put his phone in the area at the right time. Carlos Ortiz would later tell investigators that Hernandez had admitted to shooting Lloyd and would describe Hernandez's stated motive. Lloyd had been associating with people Hernandez had conflicts with. Then came the detail that transformed the investigation from strong to devastating. Investigators alleged on the morning of June 18th, the day after the murder, Hernandez asked Cheyenne to remove a large, heavy box from their basement. Cheyenne, by her own later testimony, wrapped the box in garbage bags, put it in her sister's car, and dumped it in a dumpster at a location she said she couldn't remember. She described the smell coming from the box as skunky. Prosecutors believed that box contained the murder weapon. The .45 caliber Glock used to kill Odin Lloyd was never recovered, but the act of disposing of it became its own evidence. It became the foundation of a conspiracy charge. On June 26, 2013, 9 days after Odin Lloyd's body was found in a field a mile from his house, police surrounded Aaron Hernandez's North Attleboro home. He walked out in handcuffs, wearing a white t-shirt. Hours later, the New England Patriots released him from his contract. The $40 million was gone. The house would eventually follow. The freedom was already gone. And what remained, what he would carry into a courtroom and then into a cell, was an identity that no amount of talent had prepared him to construct. Not a player, not a star, not a partner or a father in any conventional sense. A defendant, and that's when the smile appeared. Because here's the thing about Aaron Hernandez in court that everyone who watched those proceedings remarked upon. He carried himself with composure that read, depending on who you asked, as either confidence or delusion. He laughed with his attorneys. He made eye contact with the jury in ways that criminal defense coaches explicitly advise against. Too direct, too unblinking, a stare that some jurors later described as unsettling. He dressed well. He sat straight. He performed, whether intentionally or not, a version of himself that seemed to believe the outcome was not yet determined. And it wasn't. For a while, it genuinely wasn't. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses who directly observed Hernandez pull a trigger. The murder weapon was never found. The case relied on surveillance footage, cell tower data, forensic connections, and the testimony of associates who had their own legal exposure and their own reasons to cooperate with prosecutors. Defense attorneys attacked every pillar. They questioned the reliability of Ortiz as a witness. They challenged the surveillance footage interpretation. They argued that the prosecution was constructing a narrative from fragments and asking the jury to fill in the gaps with assumption rather than evidence. It was a legitimate defense strategy, and it created, in the minds of at least some observers, genuine uncertainty. But then the jury deliberated, and on April 15, 2015, they came back. Guilty of first-degree murder by extreme atrocity or cruelty. Guilty of unlawful possession of a firearm. Guilty of unlawful possession of ammunition. The smile in that moment was gone. I want to pause right here and ask you something directly, because I think this question matters. Do you believe the right verdict was reached? Bearing in mind the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the complexity of the witness testimony, the absence of the murder weapon, do you believe justice was served for Odin Lloyd? Leave your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely asking. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe right now, because we're about to get into the part of this story that most people don't know. The part that came after the gavel, in a prison cell with a Bible and a pen. Aaron Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and transferred to the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts. Let that word land for a moment. Life without the possibility of parole. At 25 years old, he would watch his daughter grow up through prison glass, through phone calls, through photographs passed through channels designed for exactly this kind of distance. He would follow his former teammate seasons through whatever news filtered into the facility. He would watch the Patriots win Super Bowls from behind walls. And something in him began to change. People who interacted with Hernandez during his incarceration describe a man who moved through distinct phases: early defiance, then a consuming preoccupation with religion, with scripture, with questions about the soul that he had apparently never spent much time with before. He read the Bible obsessively. He began talking about reincarnation, about souls and transitions, and what he described as a timeless realm. His legal situation continued to evolve. He was facing 2 additional murder charges: the 2012 killings of Daniel DeBrew and Safiro Furtado, a double homicide that prosecutors alleged Hernandez had committed in a separate incident. That trial proceeded while he was already serving life, and in an outcome that stunned observers. Just 5 days before his death, Hernandez was acquitted of both murders. He cried when the verdict was read. Inmates reported him talking afterward about the possibility of an appeal on the Lloyd conviction succeeding, about returning to football, about spending real time with Ale. He did not appear to people around him to be a man making plans to die. But that same week, something was happening that no one in his immediate circle fully understood. He was reportedly discussing with other inmates a specific provision of Massachusetts law known as the abatement doctrine. The abatement doctrine states that if a convicted person dies while their appeal of that conviction is still active, the conviction can be vacated, erased. Legally speaking, the person dies as someone who has not been convicted. The implications for his family were potentially significant with the conviction vacated. Financial claims against the Patriots in the NFL and his estate itself could potentially be accessed by Cheyenne and Ale without a murder conviction standing in the way. One line in his eventual suicide note to Cheyenne read, "You're rich." 2 words, sitting in a letter written on the last night of his life. I need to ask you this directly because it's a question that everyone who has studied this case obsesses over. Do you think Aaron Hernandez's death was a calculated act designed to protect his family financially? Or do you believe it was the act of man in genuine psychological and spiritual crisis? Or both? Because the answer might be both. And that's the most uncomfortable possibility of all. Comment below. I want your honest take. On the evening of April 18th, 2017, Hernandez made one final phone call. He reached Cheyenne at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center's prison phones. He also spoke briefly with Ale. The call lasted until the facility shut down phone access at night. It was, by Cheyenne's own account, a completely normal conversation. He didn't say "I love you." He didn't say goodbye in any meaningful sense. He told her the doors were closing, and he had to go. She said there was nothing in the conversation. No weight, no finality, no hidden signal she could identify in retrospect. Just, "Babe, I've got to go. They're closing the doors." And the line went dead. That was the last time anyone heard Aaron Hernandez's voice. Sometime during the early hours of April 19th, 2017, Hernandez jammed his cell door with cardboard to prevent entry. He tied a bedsheet to a window grate. He took a Bible and opened it to John 3, verse 16, the verse about eternal life, about whosoever believeth not perishing. He wrote those chapter and verse numbers on his own forehead in red ink. He wrote them on the cell wall in blood, and he left 3 handwritten letters on the table. At 3:03 in the morning, guards found him in his cell. He was transported to UMass Leominster Hospital and pronounced dead at 4:07 a.m. He was 27 years old. The note to Cheyenne was the longest, multi-page, the most emotionally dense of the 3. It was released publicly through court filings weeks after his death. And when the media got hold of it, certain phrases became the subject of analysis that continues to this day. He opened by calling her his soulmate. He said he wanted her to live her life and know he was always with her. Then, "I told you what was coming in directly." That sentence, think about what it contains. He is asserting that he telegraphed this, that somewhere in the normal fabric of their communication, the prison phone calls, the visits, the letters, he had left signals, and she had not seen them, or had not recognized them as what they were. Is that an accusation? A reassurance? A way of saying he hadn't simply abandoned her without warning, that there had been a language between them that she was fluent in, but that she simply hadn't decoded in time? Cheyenne herself has said she had no idea, that nothing in that final phone call felt different from any other. The interviewer who later sat with her put it this way: "You look at the absence of what was there, not the presence." And she agreed. There was just nothing that signaled anything. He told her they were soulmates who had split into 2 to come change the world. He told her she was a definition of God's love. He told her to tell his story fully, but to never doubt how much he loved her. And then, this was the Supreme Almighty's plan, not mine. With those words, Aaron Hernandez removed himself from the category of agent. He was not making a choice. He was fulfilling an assignment. Whether you read that as genuine spiritual belief, as rationalization, as a product of a brain that CTE had fundamentally altered, it's a sentence that does a very specific thing. It takes the weight of the decision and places it somewhere outside himself, then you're rich. And we're back to that question. The note to Ale, his 4-year-old daughter, was released through his attorney's 2018 book rather than through court filings. It opened with a promise that its own existence immediately broke. Daddy will never leave you. You're always in my heart. He told her he was entering the timeless realm, that he would be able to take any form, see all outcomes, exist beyond the limitations of a body or a cell or a sentence. He wrote to a 4-year-old using language that was simultaneously metaphysical and paternal. And a collision of those two registers is heartbreaking in a way that's hard to articulate. He was trying to explain eternity to a child who would grow up reading this letter and trying to understand what her father meant. He wrote, "Never fear me, but love me with all of you." That phrase, "never fear me," is the one that catches in my throat every time I read it, because it implies that he knew that at some level, in some part of himself, he understood that his daughter would one day confront the full picture of who he was. The conviction, the crime scene photographs, the testimony, the evidence. And he was, in advance, asking her not to be afraid of what she found. Asking her to separate the father who called her on prison phones from the person those records described. The note to his attorney, Jose Baez, the same lawyer who had famously represented Casey Anthony and who had just won Hernandez an acquittal in the double murder case, was tonally different from the other two. It was part gratitude, part spiritual declaration, part prophecy. He asked Baez to contact specific musicians whose work had sustained him through his incarceration. He called Baez a very special man with God-given talent. And then the language shifted into something more urgent, more grandiose. He wrote that the Most High had put him in this position to educate the world, and that the world would know who God really is. Baez himself later described this note as not overtly suicidal in tone. It read more like a mission statement than a farewell, and yet was written on the same night, with the same pen by the same hand. 3 notes, 3 different registers, 3 facets of a man who was, in his final hours, simultaneously a lover, a father, a believer, and something else, something harder to name. In September 2017, 5 months after his death, the results of a brain examination came back from Boston University's CTE Center. Aaron Hernandez had stage 3 chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Stage 3, out of 4, in a brain that was 27 years old. Researchers described it as the most severe case of CTE they had ever documented in a person under 30. The disease, caused by repeated head trauma sustained over years of football, had left his brain riddled with the protein tangles that characterize the condition at its most advanced stage. Stage 3 CTE, in individuals who develop it over decades of exposure, is associated with severe impulse control problems, paranoia, explosive rage, and suicidal ideation. In Hernandez, it had developed in a brain that had been absorbing hits since childhood, through high school, through college, through 4 seasons of professional football in one of the most physically demanding positions on the field. Baez was unequivocal about what this meant. For him, the primary symptom of stage 3 CTE was what they were looking at: the suicide itself, the violence, the paranoia, the inability to back away from confrontation, the spiritual obsession, the final act, all of it, in Baez's framework, traceable to a disease that had been developing in Aaron Hernandez's skull without anyone knowing, without any tests available to detect it, without any intervention possible even if someone had known. Hernandez's estate filed suit against the NFL and the Patriots, alleging failure to protect him from the injuries that caused his condition. The case settled in 2019 on undisclosed terms. But the settlement didn't answer the question. It never does. Money never answers a question that's actually being asked, which is, who is responsible and what would have had to be different? And where exactly did this become inevitable? Here is where I want to sit with you for a moment, because we've covered a lot of ground. We've moved from a football field to a crime scene to a courtroom to a prison cell to a brain examined posthumously under fluorescent laboratory light. And across all of that distance, the question I keep returning to is the one Aaron Hernandez himself posed in his note to Cheyenne. At what point was this the plan? Was there a moment when Aaron Hernandez could have turned away from every subsequent decision? A fork in the road where a different choice would have led somewhere else entirely? Was it when his father died and no one understood how catastrophically that loss had destabilized him? Was it when the Patriots drafted him and the people responsible for monitoring his well-being chose to look at his on-field performance rather than the warning signs already accumulating around him? Was it one night in a nightclub, one conversation with the wrong person, one decision to get in a car instead of staying home? Or was it earlier than all of that, written into the biology of a brain absorbing trauma that no one recognized as trauma, compounding silently over years until the person inside that brain was no longer fully in control of the person outside it? I don't think there's one answer. I think all of those answers are partially true simultaneously. And I think that's the most terrifying thing about this case. Not the crime, not the verdict, not even the suicide note. The most terrifying thing is a possibility that the outcome was never as far from ordinary circumstances as we need it to be. Where do you draw the line between a person making choices and a person whose capacity to make choices has been systematically compromised? Between accountability and tragedy? Leave your answer below. This is a question I genuinely can't resolve, and I don't think you can either, and I think that discomfort is worth sitting in. Here's what happened to the people left behind. Cheyenne Jenkins Hernandez has continued to raise Ale, now a young child growing up with a father who exists only in notes, in footage, in the kind of complicated historical record that will follow her for the rest of her life. Cheyenne has spoken publicly about the Netflix documentary that examined Aaron's life, and she has been clear that the exploration of his sexuality in that documentary felt like a violation, not because of the subject matter itself, because he wasn't alive to speak for himself. She said she would have accepted him regardless. She said it would have been a beautiful thing, not a shameful one, and that she wished he had told her because she would not have loved him any differently. And she wished she'd been able to tell him that while he was still alive. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ultimately ruled in 2019 that the abatement doctrine would not automatically apply in cases where a defendant died during appeal. Aaron Hernandez's conviction in the murder of Odin Lloyd was reinstated. If part of his calculation on that April night had been about protecting his family financially through the mechanism of that doctrine, the "you're rich" in that note, it hadn't worked. The loophole closed. Odin Lloyd's family has lived, for over a decade now, in the specific kind of grief that comes not just from loss, but from spectacle. From having the person who took someone from you become the subject of documentaries and retrospectives and analytical deep dives that examine every dimension of that person's psychology and circumstance. From having to watch the world mourn a narrative even as they mourn a person. Lloyd was 27 years old. He played semi-professional football. He was dating a girl named Shania. He sent his sister a text that said, "Just so you know, that's who he was." And no verdict, no documentary, no analysis of anyone else's brain chemistry changes what his family lost when that jogger found him in a field in North Attleboro on a June morning in 2013. Aaron Hernandez's last words, the ones spoken out loud, were mundane. "Babe, I've got to go. They're closing the doors." A man telling his fiancée that institutional routine was ending their conversation, not knowing or not saying that he would not be calling again. His last words in writing were three separate truths addressed to three separate people who each held a different part of him. To Cheyenne, the person who had known him the longest and loved him through things that would have broken most people. "You're my soulmate. I told you. Tell my story. You're rich." To Ale, the 4-year-old girl who would grow up holding a letter from a man she barely had time to know. "Daddy will never leave you. Life is eternal. Never fear me. I'll see you in heaven." To Baez, the lawyer who had just won him a victory that came 5 days too late. "You're a special man. The Most High put me here for a reason." And next to all those words, an open Bible, John 3 verse 16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Those weren't Aaron Hernandez's words, but they were the words he chose to die beside. He was 27 years old. He had been, at various points in his brief life, extraordinary and dangerous and loving and paranoid and talented and broken and famous and isolated and sick in ways no one had the tools to see until it was too late to matter. He left 3 notes, one open Bible, and a question that no verdict, no doctrine, no settlement, and no documentary has ever quite managed to answer. At what point did any of this become inevitable? We'll never know. So I'm leaving you with a question that I think is actually underneath all of it. Not what did Aaron Hernandez do, not even why, but this: how close to our own edges do we have to stand before we understand what it means to go over? How much of what we call choice is actually the product of circumstances so layered, so early, so biological, so social, that calling it choice becomes almost meaningless? And what do we owe each other in that space? The children who lose parents too early? The players whose brains absorb damage no one measures until after they're gone? The families of victims who don't get retrospectives? Only grief? Leave your honest thoughts below. Not what you think you should say, what you actually think. I read every comment, and this community is one of the best conversations on this platform because of the people who show up and engage seriously with hard questions. If this case moved you, if it made you think, if it kept you here, hit like. It genuinely helps. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the next case I'm covering carries the same weight as this one and asks questions just as impossible to shake. Somewhere tonight, a family is carrying a loss that nobody's making a documentary about. And somewhere else, a young person is one bad decision away from a life they can't walk back from. The difference between those stories, and this one is smaller than we need it to be. That's what Aaron Hernandez leaves us with. And that's why this case won't leave me alone.